There exists a challenge that was never widely mentioned in history books. A natural adversary that carried no weapons, wore no uniforms, and followed no known military strategy. This challenge was everywhere, hidden in the trees, under the leaves, inside the tunnels, and even in the soldiers' clothing. We're talking about the ants of Vietnam, tiny creatures that became one of the greatest nightmares for American troops during one of the most controversial conflicts of the 20th century. This is the story that was rarely told, the story of an invisible threat where size did not determine danger. When the first American soldiers landed in Vietnam in the early 1960s, they were prepared to face various operational challenges and the difficulties of operations in unknown territory. Trained at the finest military academies, equipped with cutting-edge technology, and confident in their preparation, these young men did not imagine they would have to deal with an army of insects that had evolved over millions of years to dominate the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese jungle was their territory, and humans were merely intruders. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the time you're watching this video. Your participation is very important to us. The tropical forest of Vietnam is one of the most complex and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. With temperatures that rarely drop below 25 degrees Celsius and humidity that frequently exceeds 90%, this environment creates perfect conditions for the proliferation of numerous insect species. Among all these creatures, ants reign supreme. There are over 1,000 different species of ants cataloged in the region, each with its own characteristics, behaviors, and levels of aggressiveness. But some of them stood out not only for their abundance, but for their ability to cause pain, suffering, and even put lives at risk. The first species that terrorized American soldiers was the tropical fire ant, scientifically known as Solenopsis geminata. These ants, with their reddish bodies measuring between 3 and 6 millimeters in length, seemed harmless at first glance. But appearances are drastically deceiving when it comes to these creatures. Tropical fire ants build their nests in the soil, creating mounds that can go unnoticed by inexperienced eyes, especially when covered by low vegetation. A single nest can house from 100,000 to 500,000 individuals, all ready to defend their colony with impressive ferocity. The venom of these ants contains a complex mixture of alkaloids and proteins that cause an intense burning sensation, hence the name fire ant. When a soldier accidentally stepped on a nest or leaned near one during a patrol, hundreds or even thousands of ants would quickly climb up their boots, pants, and uniform. The attack was coordinated and devastating. They didn't sting immediately. First, dozens of ants would position themselves on the victim's skin, and then, as if obeying an invisible command, they would all sting simultaneously. The pain was described by soldiers as if someone were applying lit cigarettes to multiple points on the body at the same time. Medical reports from that era document cases of soldiers who went into anaphylactic shock after being attacked by swarms of fire ants. The allergic reaction to the venom could cause severe swelling, respiratory difficulty, drop in blood pressure, and in extreme cases, cardiac arrest. But even for those who didn't develop severe allergic reactions, the stings left painful pustules that took days to heal. In a humid and unhealthy jungle environment, these wounds frequently became infected, causing additional complications that left soldiers incapacitated for weeks. The second species that caused terror in American ranks was even more feared, the bullet ant or Paraponera clavata. Although less common in the lowland regions of Vietnam, this species was found in mountainous and forested areas where many military operations occurred. Measuring up to 2.5 centimeters in length, these black ants were impossible to ignore when seen. Their name comes from the description of the pain caused by their sting, frequently compared to one of the most intense sensations a human being can experience. On the insect sting pain scale developed by entomologist Justin Schmidt, the bullet ant receives the maximum score of 4, described as capable of causing pure, intense, and brilliant pain, like walking on burning coals with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel. The soldiers who had the unfortunate encounter with these ants reported that the pain was not only intense but also long-lasting. While the sting of a bee or wasp might hurt intensely for a few minutes, the pain caused by the bullet ant persisted for 12 to 24 hours, pulsing in waves that prevented sleep, concentration, and any normal activity. Some men described uncontrollable tremors in the affected limb, as if the nervous system itself were being directly attacked. And indeed it was. The venom of the bullet ant contains a neurotoxin called ponertoxin, which interferes with the sodium channels of nerve cells, causing continuous depolarization and constant pain signals to the brain. Imagine a young 20-year-old soldier, far from home for the first time, trying to survive in a hostile jungle where every sound could be a threat. Now imagine that same soldier being stung by a bullet ant during a nighttime reconnaissance mission. The excruciating pain not only temporarily incapacitated him, but also compromised the entire operation. A cry of pain could reveal the position of the entire unit. The inability to maintain focus or perform basic tasks could compromise the safety not only of him but of his companions. Bullet ants made no distinction between soldiers, officers, or medics. They attacked anyone who invaded their territory. But perhaps the most problematic species, due to its absolute abundance, was the weaver ant or Ecophylla smaragdina. These bright green ants, which built elaborate nests by joining leaves with silk produced by their larvae, were extremely territorial and aggressive. Weaver ant colonies could occupy several trees, creating networks of interconnected nests that housed up to 500,000 individuals. When threatened, these ants not only defended their specific nest but mobilized ants from the entire network of colonies for a massive counterattack. Soldiers quickly learned to identify trees occupied by weaver ants, but it wasn't always possible to avoid them. During tactical operations or when seeking cover, there was no time to inspect each tree. Leaning against a tree inhabited by these ants resulted in an instant attack. Hundreds of ants would descend upon the soldier, biting with their powerful mandibles while simultaneously spraying formic acid into the wounds. The combination of bite and acid created a burning pain that spread quickly. Worse still, weaver ants were notoriously difficult to remove. They clung with fierce determination, and even when the body was pulled away, their heads frequently remained attached to the skin, with their mandibles still closed. There was also the trapjaw ant, known as Odontomachus. These ants possessed mandibles that functioned like springs, capable of closing at impressive speeds, between 130 and 230 kilometers per hour, making them the fastest-moving biological structures in the animal kingdom. When these mandibles struck human skin, the impact was similar to being hit by a needle fired from a low-powered pistol. The pain was sharp and surprising, and the force of the closure was sufficient to pierce the skin and cause bleeding. Soldiers reported encounters with these ants in underground tunnels, where clearing operations were particularly dangerous. In the confined and dark spaces of the tunnels used by Vietnamese forces, an ant sting could cause a startle that would lead to accidents, falls, or the revelation of the soldier's position. The Siu Chi tunnels and other underground systems represented a unique challenge for American forces. These underground labyrinths, some extending for hundreds of kilometers, were home not only to people, but also to countless colonies of ants that had established nests in the moist earth walls. The so-called tunnel rats, specialized soldiers who volunteered to explore these claustrophobic systems, faced not only the danger of traps but also constant attacks from insects. With limited space to maneuver and often only a weak flashlight for illumination, distinguishing between earth, roots, and ant nests was virtually impossible. Many tunnel rats developed a genuine fear of ants, sometimes even greater than other fears. The Asian army ant, or Aenictus, although less common, was perhaps the most terrifying when encountered. These nomadic ants didn't build permanent nests but traveled in massive columns containing millions of individuals, consuming everything in their path. Although they preferred invertebrate prey such as other ants, termites, and spiders, they didn't hesitate to attack larger animals, including humans, if they blocked their path or threatened the colony. There are unconfirmed but persistent reports of injured soldiers who couldn't move being attacked by columns of army ants. The truth of these reports is debated, but the fear they generated was absolutely real. What made all these species particularly problematic was not just their ability to cause pain, but the fact that they operated in overwhelming numbers. An American soldier, no matter how well trained, had no effective defense against an attack by thousands of ants. Conventional military equipment was useless against them. Even the insect repellents available at the time had limited effectiveness against ants determined to defend their colonies. Soldiers learned survival techniques through trial and error, often at the cost of significant suffering. A common tactic was to use gasoline or kerosene to destroy identified nests, but this wasn't always practical or safe, especially when the element of surprise was necessary. Fire could reveal positions and attract unwanted attention. Another strategy was simply to avoid areas known to have high concentrations of aggressive ants. But in an active operational environment, such luxuries as choosing the terrain rarely existed. Often, the only option was to endure the attacks, remove the ants as quickly as possible, and treat the stings with the limited medical supplies available. The medical consequences of ant attacks were more serious than many commanders initially recognized. Beyond the immediate pain and potentially fatal allergic reactions, there were significant secondary complications. The stings created multiple entry points for bacteria in an environment where practically everything was contaminated. Stagnant water, soil, decomposing vegetation, everything harbored pathogens that could cause serious infections. Soldiers who received dozens or hundreds of stings frequently developed skin infections that required aggressive antibiotics. In severe cases, untreated infections could lead to sepsis, a potentially fatal condition where the infection spread through the bloodstream. There was also the psychological impact. Soldiers who had experienced severe ant attacks developed constant hypervigilance. Every sensation on the skin, every movement perceived in the corner of the eye, every rustling in the leaves could be ants. This constant anxiety contributed to operational stress, exacerbating conditions that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. For many veterans, memories of the ants were as vivid and disturbing as other difficult memories of service. Some developed lasting phobias of insects that persisted decades after returning home. Medical officers in Vietnam quickly realized they needed to develop specific protocols to deal with ant attacks. Instructions were distributed on how to identify severe allergic reactions that required immediate epinephrine. Techniques for rapid ant removal were taught, including the use of water when available, or simply brushing vigorously in the opposite direction to which the ants were climbing. Soldiers were instructed to inspect each other regularly, especially after moving through dense vegetation. Learning to identify the signs of ant nests became part of jungle survival training. Interestingly, the local Vietnamese inhabitants had a different relationship with these creatures. Raised in that environment, they had learned from childhood how to avoid nests, identify dangerous species from a distance, and even use ants to their advantage. There are reports of traps deliberately positioned near nests of aggressive ants, where people in movement would inevitably disturb them. Some narratives suggest that weaver ant nests were occasionally transported and strategically positioned, creating an additional element of chaos. Although it's difficult to verify such tactics through official documentation, the advantage of deeply knowing the natural environment is undeniable. Ants also affected military logistics in unexpected ways. Supplies left unprotected, even for just a few hours, could be invaded by ants that contaminated food, infiltrated sensitive electronic equipment, and damaged materials. Rations needed to be stored in airtight containers, but even so, ants managed to find the smallest cracks. There were stories of soldiers opening their rations to discover that ants had consumed or contaminated the contents overnight. Radio equipment, critical for communication, sometimes failed because ants had built nests inside them, attracted by the heat of electronic components. Backpacks left on the ground frequently became the temporary home of ants. Soldiers learned the hard way to always hang their belongings on trees or elevated structures, and even then, arboreal ants could still reach them. Boots and uniforms had to be shaken vigorously before being worn in the morning. And still, ants hidden in seams or folds could go unnoticed until they began to sting. Sleeping on the ground was an open invitation to wake up covered in ants. Hammocks were essential, but had to be carefully inspected and positioned away from trees inhabited by aggressive colonies. The relationship between soldiers and ants transcended the purely physical. These creatures represented something greater, a constant reminder that they were in a territory that was not theirs, in an environment that others knew deeply in ways they never could. Ants were part of the fabric of the Vietnamese jungle, evolved and adapted through geological eras to dominate that specific ecological niche. Humans, with all their technology, were temporary visitors who could never compete with the intimate knowledge that native creatures possessed of their own habitat. Some soldiers developed a kind of reluctant respect for the ants. Observing colonies in moments of calm, they were impressed by the organization, efficiency, and determination of these tiny societies. Worker ants carrying loads many times larger than their own bodies, soldier ants defending nest entrances with complete fearlessness, and the complex coordination of thousands of individuals working in unison toward common goals. All of this presented a curious parallel to their own military experiences. There was something deeply humbling in recognizing that creatures with brains containing less than 1 million neurons could execute such effective defensive strategies. The ant species of Vietnam had developed an impressive variety of venoms and defensive tactics through natural selection. Each component of their venoms served specific purposes. Alkaloids caused pain to dissuade predators. Proteins induced inflammatory reactions that made future attackers more cautious. Peptides ruptured cell membranes, causing tissue damage that required time to heal. Neurotoxins interfered with nervous systems, causing temporary paralysis or prolonged pain. These venoms were the result of millions of years of defensive evolution, refined through countless generations for maximum effectiveness. Compared to other regions of the world, Southeast Asian ants are notably aggressive and venomous. This is due in part to the intense competition for resources in tropical forests where biodiversity is extremely high. Ants that couldn't effectively defend their nests and territories against numerous predators and competitors simply wouldn't survive. The result is a set of species that evolved to be exceptionally well-armed and prone to attack any perceived threat with overwhelming force. American soldiers weren't just facing ants, they were facing the product of an evolutionary process that favored extreme aggressiveness. Curiously, the local Vietnamese populations had long learned to coexist with these creatures, and even to use them. Weaver ants, for example, were used in traditional medicine, being consumed whole or macerated to create preparations that supposedly had anti-inflammatory properties. Some species were considered culinary delicacies, adding an acidic and crunchy flavor to various dishes. Farmers used weaver ants as natural biological control of pests in plantations, especially fruit orchards, where these ants preyed on herbivorous insects. This mutualistic relationship between humans and ants in Vietnamese culture contrasted drastically with the purely antagonistic experience of American soldiers. Scientific research on venomous ants and their toxins has advanced considerably since that time. Today, we understand that ant venoms contain compounds with significant medical potential. Antimicrobial peptides found in ant venoms are being studied as possible next-generation antibiotics. Specific neurotoxins are being investigated as tools to understand neurological diseases. Ironically, the same substances that caused so much suffering to soldiers may eventually contribute to medical treatments that will save lives. Nature frequently operates this way, where venoms and cures are separated only by dose and application. The encounters between American soldiers and Vietnamese ants also generated a body of folklore and stories that persist to this day among veterans. Exaggerated tales of giant ants, reports of nests the size of houses, and stories of coordinated attacks that seemed almost too intelligent to be the work of insects. Although many of these stories are clearly embellished, they reflect the genuine psychological impact that these encounters had. When you're exhausted, afraid, far from home, and dealing with constant pain, your perception of reality naturally distorts. The ants, already legitimately dangerous, became monsters in the narratives shared among soldiers during long nights at isolated bases. Military medical documents from the era show that thousands of soldiers sought treatment for insect stings, with ants representing a significant portion of these cases. Although rare, there were documented cases of deaths attributed to severe allergic reactions to ant stings, especially in situations where immediate medical treatment was not available. For each death, there were hundreds of cases of soldiers temporarily incapacitated, unable to perform their functions due to pain and inflammation. The cumulative impact on military readiness was substantial, although rarely quantified in official analyses of the conflict. The experience with ants in Vietnam eventually influenced subsequent military training. Soldiers assigned to operations in tropical environments today receive specific education about venomous insects and how to avoid them or deal with encounters. modern insect repellents are significantly more effective than those available in the 1960s and 70s. Medical protocols for dealing with allergic reactions are more robust, with epinephrine and antihistamines being standard components of field medical kits. The lessons learned, often through painful experiences, contributed to tangible improvements in military practices. But beyond the military and medical implications, there is a philosophical dimension to this story. The conflict in Vietnam was characterized by many asymmetries, not just in tactics and objectives, but in the very relationship of people with the environment. For American forces, the jungle was a hostile obstacle to be overcome through technology. For the local inhabitants, it was home, an ally that offered cover, resources, and advantages for those who knew its secrets. Ants were just one facet of this environment, but a facet that perfectly illustrated how ignorance and lack of adaptation could transform natural elements into formidable adversaries. There is a particular irony in how such small creatures could cause such big problems for a powerful military organization. Advanced technology, sophisticated equipment, none of this offered protection against ants. A general with decades of military experience was as vulnerable to a bullet ant attack as a newly arrived recruit. This forced equalization reminded everyone that, despite hierarchies and technologies, at the most basic level, all were just humans in a natural environment that didn't respect ranks or distinctions. The ants also played a role in the narratives that emerged during and after the conflict. Stories of soldiers suffering not just from operational difficulties but from countless insect stings reinforced the perception that the situation was complex and challenging. The image of young men facing not just human challenges but also nature itself resonated with those who questioned the objectives and execution of American involvement in Vietnam. The ants, inadvertently, became symbols of the difficulty of operating in an environment fundamentally hostile to that presence. Veterans who returned from Vietnam frequently brought with them not only physical and psychological traumas but also vivid memories of the minor but constant difficulties, such as ant attacks. In veteran reunions and support groups, stories about ants are shared with surprising frequency. For some, these memories are almost humorous in retrospect, bizarre anecdotes from a surreal period of their lives. For others, they remain associated with deeper traumas, inseparable from the broader context of suffering and loss. Modern science continues to study the ants of Southeast Asia, and new species are discovered regularly. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how these social insects evolved such sophisticated strategies of defense and attack. Entomologists using modern technologies such as microcomputed tomography and genetic analysis are revealing intricate details about the structure of mandibles, the chemical composition of venoms, and the neural mechanisms that allow coordination among thousands of individuals. What soldiers experienced as chaotic attacks by furious creatures was, in reality, highly organized behavior governed by complex chemical signals and sophisticated communication. Pheromones play a central role in the social organization of ants. When an ant detects a threat, it releases alarm pheromones that quickly recruit other workers and soldiers for defense. These volatile chemical substances spread through the air, creating a concentration gradient that guides reinforcements directly to the site of the disturbance. Different pheromones communicate different levels of threat, allowing graduated responses. A small disturbance may result in cautious investigation, while a larger threat triggers massive mobilization. American soldiers, unknowingly, frequently triggered the most extreme defensive responses simply by their scale and abrupt movements. Tactile communication is also crucial. Ants touch each other with antennae, transmitting information about direction, threat intensity, and need for assistance. When defending their colonies, this ability to coordinate silently gave ants a significant advantage. They didn't need audible or visual signals that could be detected and interpreted. Their communication was invisible, inaudible, and incredibly efficient. For a soldier being attacked, it seemed that the ants acted with an almost supernatural unified purpose, when in reality they were following instinctive programming refined through millions of years. The role of the queen in each colony illustrates another fascinating aspect of ant biology. While individual soldiers live only weeks or months, queens of some species can live decades, continuously producing new generations of workers and soldiers. This means that ant colonies operating during the period in Vietnam were, in some cases, the same colonies that their ancestors had established decades before. These insect societies had a continuity and permanence that contrasted dramatically with the transient presence of human military forces. The ants were there before the period, during the period, and remained long after the last soldier departed. Considering the broader ecological impact, the period of conflict in Vietnam massively disturbed natural ecosystems through military operations and constant movement of troops and equipment. Interestingly, ants, being incredibly adaptable and resilient, frequently thrived in disturbed habitats. Areas where primary forest had been affected were quickly colonized by opportunistic ant species. In some cases, the density of nests in disturbed areas was greater than in intact forest. This meant that soldiers operating in certain zones paradoxically faced greater concentrations of ants than they might have encountered in virgin jungle. Leafcutter ants, although not particularly aggressive toward humans, caused indirect problems by cutting and transporting leaves that soldiers might have used for camouflage or improvised cover. Observing long columns of leafcutter ants transporting perfectly circular sections of leaves was a common spectacle, but one that also reminded soldiers of how completely insect life dominated that environment. Each square meter of forest harbored not just one but multiple ant species, each occupying its specific niche, competing and cooperating in an ecological network of incomprehensible complexity. Termites, although not true ants, were frequently confused with them and caused similar problems. Their massive nests, built from earth and hardened saliva, were impressive structures that could reach meters in height. When destroyed by explosions or vehicle movement, swarms of soldier termites would emerge to defend the nest, biting anything in their path. Their mandibles, although smaller than those of many ants, were still capable of tearing skin and causing considerable pain. The confusion between ants and termites added to the general sense that the jungle itself was animated with small determined biters. The seasons of the year dramatically influenced the behavior and abundance of ants. During the rainy season, when water was abundant and vegetation flourished, colonies experienced explosive population growth. New queens were produced, nuptial flights occurred, and the density of nests increased. For soldiers operating during these periods, encounters with ants were virtually inevitable. The dry season, although bringing its own challenges such as scarcity of drinking water, frequently meant fewer encounters with ants, as many species reduced activity to conserve resources. Experienced commanders eventually learned to consider these seasonal patterns when planning operations, although they rarely had the luxury of choosing when and where to engage. Night brought its own challenges. Many ant species are nocturnal, foraging and defending their nests more actively after sunset. For soldiers on nighttime operations, this meant a greater likelihood of encounters. Darkness also made it impossible to see ants until they were already climbing up clothing. The use of flashlights had to be minimized to avoid revealing positions, so soldiers frequently had to rely on touch, perceiving ants only when they began to sting. The combination of nighttime operational tension and the invisible threat of ants created a state of particularly intense psychological stress. Some soldiers developed almost superstitious techniques to avoid ants. Rituals such as touching trees before approaching them, avoiding certain types of vegetation, or carrying supposedly protective talismans were common. Although objectively ineffective, these behaviors provided a sense of control in a situation where real control was limited. Human psychology seeks patterns and meaning, and when confronted with apparently random attacks from insects, the mind creates narratives and strategies, even if irrational. These behaviors also served a social function, creating shared culture and sense of camaraderie through common experiences. The medical treatment of ant stings evolved during the period as doctors gained experience. Initially, stings were frequently underestimated, treated as minor nuisances that didn't justify serious medical attention. But as more cases of severe complications were documented, more rigorous protocols were implemented. Soldiers with multiple stings were monitored for signs of allergic reactions. Wounds were cleaned and disinfected meticulously to prevent secondary infections. Analgesics were administered not only for comfort but to keep soldiers functional. Military medicine adapted, as it always does, to the realities of the field. There were also research efforts to develop more effective repellents specifically against ants. Military chemists experimented with various formulations, trying to find compounds that would deter ants without being excessively toxic to humans or impractical for field application. Some limited successes were achieved, but the reality is that ants, with their highly developed sensory systems and evolutionary adaptability, were challenging adversaries even for modern chemistry. Repellents that worked against one species were frequently ineffective against others. Ants that initially avoided certain substances could become habituated to them over time. The experience of Vietnamese ants also influenced literature and popular culture about the period. Memoirs written by veterans frequently include vivid passages about encounters with insects. Films and documentaries occasionally mention ants as part of the broader representation of the difficulties of the jungle. Although rarely the main focus, these references contribute to the cultural understanding of the period as a multifaceted experience where dangers came from all directions, including the land itself. Ants became part of the cultural mythology of this historical chapter, memorable for their constancy and universality of experience. For entomologists and biologists, the forced attention to ants during the period inadvertently resulted in some increased scientific knowledge. Samples collected by medical personnel trying to identify species responsible for severe stings contributed to museum collections. Observations by soldiers, when documented, provided data on distribution and behavior of species. Although it certainly wasn't the purpose, and there were significant ecological impacts, some positive scientific byproducts emerged in the increased knowledge about the myrmecofauna of the region. Reflecting on this entire peculiar chapter of history, a complex image emerges. The ants of Vietnam were not adversaries in the conventional sense. They were simply creatures living their lives, defending their nests, foraging for food, and perpetuating their species as they had done for eons. Human presence was the anomaly, the intrusion that provoked defensive responses. That these responses caused pain and suffering to humans was a natural consequence of ant biology, not malice. There was no ideology, politics, or hatred in the attacks of the ants, only pure evolutionary instinct. This perspective offers an interesting lens through which to examine the broader conflict. Just as the ants had no concept of the human conflict occurring around them, many of the soldiers had limited understanding of the political and historical complexities that had brought them there. Both ants and soldiers were acting based on programming, whether genetic or cultural, responding to circumstances beyond their individual control. The tragedy was not in the actions of the ants defending their nests, or even necessarily in the actions of soldiers following orders, but in the larger systemic decisions that placed young humans in a challenging and unfamiliar environment. The lessons of Vietnamese ants extend beyond the military to broader ecological and environmental considerations. This period dramatically demonstrated the limits of human technology when confronted with evolved natural systems. No matter how advanced the tools and technologies, we cannot conquer nature through force. Adaptation, understanding, and respect for the environment are essential for successful operations, whether in military or civilian context. Ignoring local ecology, underestimating native creatures, and assuming automatic technological superiority are recipes for difficulties. Today, decades later, the forests of Vietnam continue to be home to countless trillions of ants. The species that caused difficulties for American soldiers continue their lives, completely unaware of the role they played in human history. New nests are built where old military bases were located. Ants forage through remains of rusted military equipment, incorporating degraded metal and plastic into their nest structures. Nature, as it always does, has reclaimed the territory, transforming altered landscapes into functional ecosystems again. Ants are both agents and beneficiaries of this recovery, their ecological processes helping to decompose pollutants and recycle nutrients. For the veterans who survived, memories of the ants occupy a peculiar space in recollection. They are not memories that bring honor or glory, nor are they traumas of the same type as direct confrontations. They are memories of profound discomfort, of frustrating powerlessness, of a hostile nature that could not be negotiated or defeated. They are also memories that can be shared more easily than more severe experiences, offering an entry point for discussions about experiences without immediately entering more sensitive psychological territory. In veteran reunions, Stories about ants frequently serve as icebreakers, a common experience that almost everyone shared, regardless of their unit, rank, or when they served. There is also an element of validation in these stories. For a long time, minor difficulties faced by soldiers, including problems with insects, were dismissed or minimized by both military and civilian public. The focus was on heroic actions, larger operations, and broad strategic issues. But for the individuals living these experiences, every aspect contributed to the cumulative burden. Recognizing that ants were a genuine and serious problem validates the complete experiences of veterans, not just the most dramatic moments, but also the constant wear of difficult conditions. The story of ants and American soldiers in Vietnam is ultimately a story about humility. Humility before nature, humility before the complexity of tropical ecosystems, and humility in recognizing that force and technology don't guarantee success against organisms well adapted to their environments. It is also a story about resilience, both of the ants that survived and thrived despite the disturbances around them, and of the soldiers who endured not only obvious dangers but also countless minor difficulties that collectively created conditions of sustained suffering. At this moment, as we reflect on these historical events, it is appropriate to recognize the complexity of human experience during this period. Soldiers are not just operators, but complete individuals who experience hunger, thirst, heat, cold, illness, pain, and yes, insect stings. Each of these elements contributes to the totality of the experience. Understanding this fully requires looking beyond the grand narratives of strategy and politics to the mundane but significant details of daily life in challenging situations. The ants teach us that threats come in all sizes, that danger is not only in the obvious and dramatically visible, but also in the small, the numerous, and the persistent. That adaptation and local knowledge frequently surpass technological advantages. That nature cannot be conquered, only understood and respected. And that even in the most extreme circumstances of human conflict, life continues in all its forms, indifferent to human concerns, following its own evolutionary imperatives. May we carry these lessons forward, not only in military contexts, but in our relationship with the natural world in general. May we recognize our place as part of larger ecosystems, not their unquestionable masters. And may we honor the experiences of those who served, in all their dimensions, from the heroic to the mundane, from the grand to the microscopic. Every aspect of their experiences deserves to be remembered, understood, and respected. May the Lord God bless those who suffered, grant peace to those who have departed, and guide us all toward greater understanding and compassion.